Thank you. I want to begin by thanking you for allowing me to be part of your community today. I want to thank you, Jonathan, and you, Gigi, for inviting me to be here. It really is a privilege to be able to talk about something that we often don't speak about. I want to thank James Horton. I had an opportunity to have lunch with him yesterday, and he reminded me through his own personal story about the power of art and its role in transforming lives. So we are all in this room change agents. We are all in this room using that creative impulse that Mr. Babatunde talked about so beautifully this morning as the core of who we are. So I would like us to begin by recognizing that we are community in this room. And community consists of people who are connected to one another. So I'll ask you to remove everything that you have in your laps, your cups, your papers, to uncross your legs and put both feet on the floor. And put your butts up against the back of the chair. Why? So that your spine is straight. Sit up straight, put everything down. And without doing anything at all, I would like you to shift your focus to your breath. You are breathing, that's a good thing. So notice where you breathe. Do you breathe into the top of your chest? Do you breathe into the top of your belly? Notice where you breathe and take a moment to just close your eyes. And we're going to take 3 deep breaths together. Now, the real trick to taking a deep breath is to exhale first. So exhale first and breathe in. And as you breathe out, just relax, just let go. Breathe again. With your eyes closed, I'd like to invite you to remember a time when you were changed in some way because of your exposure to art, books, theater, music, painting, poetry, film, some event in your life where your experience of art opens you in a way that informs your life today. As you remember this experience, allow yourself to feel a bit or a lot of gratitude, to be grateful. We are so fortunate to be alive. So when you're ready, you can open your eyes and bring that gratitude with you. So we're here together having a shared experience of the transformative gifts that we have received. And I want to talk to you about why it's in our very best interest, long term, to not only understand, but to be able to talk about oppressive systems, systems that we did not create, history that we did not create, that we are born into, but that it's very important for us to understand and to bring them to light. If we can't talk about race, if we can't talk about socioeconomic barriers, we cannot build an equitable world. It just won't happen. So I want to talk to you about the system of racialization. I'm using this word. It's a term that is coined, and well, it's not coined by John Powell, but it's made popular by him. Racialization is a noun. It's a process. It is something that is constantly unfolding. We as human beings are capable of the greatest behavior and beliefs and creativity. But we all have that other side, don't we? And we have to expand our capacity to hold paradox, to be able to understand that more than one thing is true at a time. And as we awaken to that, we can make change. We can uplift one another. I am a filmmaker, and I founded an organization called World Trust. And the latest film that we've created, Cracking the Codes, Understanding the System of Racial Inequity, is designed to deepen the national conversation on race, to deepen it. So I could not do the work that I do without art. My films are art. We have theater in our films. We have movement and dancing in our films. Why? Because whole body learning is what transforms us. And what is transformative learning? It's about getting at the embedded assumptions that we all hold about how we think the world works. So I'm going to describe for you what the system of racialization looks like. Can I have that slide, please? The system of racialization is embedded in history and culture and identity. It is moved by power and economics. It has internal components and external components. The internal and external components are related to one another. It has bias. We all have conscious and unconscious bias. Those of you who've studied anything about the brain, you understand that we're taking in about 1 million bits of information per second, of which we retain 40. So, like the blind man and the elephant, we need each other to make sense of the world. So bias, conscious and unconscious bias. Privilege is something that we all have because we're all sitting here. We're all educated. We've had the privilege of going to school. We have the privilege of being in relationship with one another. But there's also a kind of privilege that speaks to what defines normal. Internalized racism. This is a place where we internalize, people of color, the messages that we receive, spoken and unspoken. This plays out in our interpersonal relationships, in our institutional relationships, which have policy, law, and that's just the way it's always been done. And we have structure, which is all of the above. This system we know is working because it churns out disparities. What is the job of a system? Anybody? What is the job of a system? To organize, to keep the status quo. A system is made up of parts, interrelated parts. And those interrelated parts are important to understand. Structural racialization refers to the ways in which the joint operation of institutions such as housing markets, public schools, health disparities, they produce racialized outcomes across space. Historically, marginalized people of color have been spatially isolated from economic, political, educational, and technological power over the course of history. Jim Crow, ghettos, barriers, and the culture of incarceration. So it's no wonder that we don't want to talk about this stuff. It's not very comfortable, is it? How many of you have in your own family unit, either the past or in the present, had a secret that needed to be exposed? For what purpose? For healing. For healing. And really, in many ways, what I'm talking about is the need for us to heal, the need for us to become whole. I know that it's not comfortable, but I also recognize that there's a lot of suffering that happens that we as artists and creative people can not only feel, but that we also have expressed in our own lives and in the work that we do. But we can't do it well if we don't name it. I've been reading a book that you kind of alluded to a little bit, Jonathan. It's a book called The Spirit Level: Why More Equal Societies Almost Always Do Better, written by Richard and Pickett. These are social epidemiologists and researchers who've done extensive global research exploring social distribution and determinants of societal well-being. Their work shows that societies with more equal distribution of incomes have better health, fewer social problems such as violence, drug abuse, teenage births, mental illness, obesity, and others, and are more cohesive than the ones in which the gap between the rich and the poor is greater. Another way to state their findings is as follows. The increased wealth of the well-to-do does not increase their level of happiness. It doesn't increase the level of happiness. The increasing disparity between the well-to-do and everyone else does significantly impact their level of happiness in a negative way. Actually, the wider the gap between rich and poor, the higher the level of societal dysfunction is what really matters. We have to look at how we stand in relationship to one another. Relationship. One way of saying this is that poverty is not a certain amount of goods, nor is it just a relation between means and ends. Above all, it is a relation between people. Poverty is a social status. It has grown as an individuous distinction between classes, and social status drives our behavior in many ways. Just think about being in high school. What drove your behavior in many ways? Think about where you work. What drives your behavior in many ways? And then here's the question. Why is there such a disproportionate amount of poverty among people of color? Why is it that black and brown folks who are, although the demographics are rapidly changing as we know, represent a smaller part of the population, but have more than twice and 3 times the amount of poverty? This ability to understand what it means to have access to opportunity is very, very critical. Everybody knows who Ralph Waldo Emerson is, and he had a collection of essays called The Conduct of Life. And he said it like this: "'Tis very certain that each man carries in his eye the exact indication of his rank in the immense scale of men, and we are always learning to read it." Is that not true? When you walk into a room, can you size up who's there, who's like you, who you should sit with? And we tend to associate with people who are like whom? Like us. John Powell, who is a scholar and actually one of my heroes, formed an organization called the Kirwan Institute. He now works in Berkeley at the Haas Diversity Research Center in Berkeley, that was funded to the tune of $16 million to look at inclusion, diversity and inclusion. He talks about the fact that there are 2 visions for America a half a century from now. One is of a society more divided between the haves and the have-nots, a country in which the rich live in gated communities, send their children to expensive schools, and have access to first-rate medical care, education, art, and the rest who live in a world marked by insecurity, at best mediocre education, and in effect, rationed health care. They hope and they pray that they don't get seriously sick. At the bottom are millions of young people who can be alienated and without hope. That is the picture in many developing countries. Economists call it a dual economy to societies living side by side. Or, the other vision is of a society where the gap between the haves and the have-nots has been narrowed, where there is a sense of shared destiny, a common commitment to opportunity and fairness, where the world and the words liberty and justice for all actually mean what they seem to mean, where we take seriously the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which emphasizes the importance not just of civil rights, but of economic rights, and not just the rights of property, but the economic rights of ordinary citizens. In this vision, we have an increasingly vibrant political system. Which vision do you want to work towards? When you have worked on an art project with a lot of people, and it comes out in an amazing way, what have you experienced? How much time do I have? What have you experienced? I see some of you from here with smiles on your faces. There's something about making the connection with others that lifts us up as human beings. There is something that prevents that. It does not lift us up as human beings. Where in your life have you found courage and had the ability to confront something that no one wants to talk about? Where in your lives have you taken a stand for justice? It's not a bad word. It's a good word. It's just about us, all of us. It's about the way that we learn to have a conversation that allows us to be better thinkers, better analyzers, better able to address what needs to be addressed. And I want to give you one very clear example before I close. Yesterday, I had an opportunity to listen to a group of people talking about art and how the community arts programs that they run, how effective they are, and what the barriers are. Even though it was very clear that we were talking about very different programs with very different socioeconomic aspects to them, we never once named it directly. So the last thing I want to talk to you about is targeted universalism. Let's just say that we in this room have a universal goal that is to provide meaningful and joyful education for all. Would that be a good thing? Of course. So what if the children that we're working with are middle class and upper middle class children? What would they need in order to meet that goal of joyful, meaningful education? Good teachers, time, administration, good materials, good resources. Yes? What if the children that you were working with were children who had been marginalized in some way? What would they need in order to have joyful and meaningful education? Everything that the other children needed, right? Plus some awareness of the curriculum and what it is that would have them feel good about who they are, expanding your idea of history, giving fuller pictures of that. A sensitivity, really good teachers. They need really good teachers and really good administration. What if you were working with children who do not speak English? What do they need? Sorry? All of that, plus their parents need to have a way to participate in their children's education, so we need interpreters. We need the children to be able to participate fully in their education, so we may have them have access to other languages, a more multicultural kind of setting? What if you're dealing with children who are impoverished? What do they need? All of the above, plus maybe some good food, good meals, good health care. And what if you were dealing with children who are incarcerated? What do they need? All of the above, plus. And here's where we come to, oh, well, they need a really strong art enrichment program, some whole body learning, ways to express themselves, some attention to the trauma that they may have experienced in their lives, almost certainly. So what we describe as necessary for those children actually would benefit all children, wouldn't it? So if we understand the populations that we're dealing with and we understand what's necessary, we can actually lift all children up by providing all of that. My grandchildren live in Japan. They will be learning Japanese this year. They have spent time in Korea. My oldest granddaughter speaks a bit of Korean. When she comes back to the United States, she brings with her a very expanded view of the world. She's 5. She's amazing because she's had exposure to so much. How many of you have ever used a ramp on the street with your baby carriage or your grocery cart or whatever it might be? We are capable of facing into issues that need to be talked about. We need to be able to talk about race and not be blind to it so that we can say that we're good people. We are good people. And good people can tell the truth. Good people can speak up. Good people can make demands of what's best for all of us in this society. So thank you so much for letting me speak to you just a little bit today. And I hope you have an amazing conference.
What are the questions that you think we aren't talking about or acknowledging in our work with one another, in communities, and within our own organizations? And I think I'd like to ask Maribel if you would just maybe start from your perspective. You've seen many, many organizations do things right, and you've seen organizations do things not so right relative to this question. And so why don't you share with us from your perspective?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I feel privileged to be in an audience that I feel the vibe of how much I'm going to learn. Of course, as you all know, every good teacher is first a learner, so it's so wonderful to be surrounded and looking at the program. I really like what Dr. Butler said about our capacity to hold paradox. One of the paradoxes that we see in our country is that while there is a lot of poverty, incarceration, inequality in major issues with some of our youth, especially in major cities, metropolitan areas, rural youth, and across all levels. We also have had an inability to connect that with what positive things have happened with youth over the last 20, 30 years, particularly, for example, with the hip-hop generation, and the fact that political mobilization and social justice agenda, sustainability, these are passionate issues that are mobilizing youth. We saw it in the last 2 recent elections, for example, in numbers that are staggering. We see the demographics, we read about them, we hear the pundits talk about them, but we don't necessarily understand the way in which that energy and that activism translates into the positive energy. And one of the reasons I suspect and I observe is because so many of our engagement with young people and children seems to always come out of a transactional motivation. In other words, we will do involve young people, we will do this because it provides this sort of benefit. If we do this, so when young people a lot of the times are invited to come into organizations, they are invited to come into the structures that are already set in place. And young people and children have a particular radar that attunes them very quickly to the agendas that other people have for them in a way that becomes an instant turn-off. And we know this since they are toddlers, right?
That's right.
They immediately, in this sense, as we become adults, we become more used to complying with some of these things, and then we refer to adolescent behavior or rebellion. But really, it's about listening to the agendas that we have versus the agendas of those that we're trying to serve. Those paradoxes of how could we have youth who do we judge immediately to be alienated, but perhaps are speaking a language of expressive creativity that is not yet reached our institutional context, those becomes the places, the nodes where the contradictions offer challenges but also the opportunity. But at the end, what I'm talking about is about transforming our practices in our institutional context more than anything else. And that practice begins with that sort of sense of listening and learning of what are those expressions that we are just not understanding. There seems to be something that we miss in that formula.
Sure.
I've been waiting to talk to you guys for months. But I think this really is a very important conversation, and I do thank Dr. Butler for putting it out there for us. I'm a practitioner. I'm a bureaucrat. I count things. I know what things work. I know how many I'm supposed to meet. But I have to tell you that this conversation is also about that place beyond the metrics, isn't it? We can count things, but it's value that we're talking about. It's human rights that Dr. Butler is talking about. It's cultural rights. Children have a right to express themselves through the lens of their own culture. But we've somehow begun to think that in arts education, we have to mandate that to happen. You know, we think that because we're teaching artists, that we're doing something that is going to enrich the lives of children who my team always hears me talk about. Those kids have assets. They come with a richness. It is their own cultural background. It is the food they eat at home. It's the family structure that they live inside of. It's their neighborhood. It's their community. So I don't want you guys to think that you're doing anything that's great and fabulous, right? You know what's right. You know when you touch something that's hot is going to burn you, so you know the difference between right and wrong. But until we decide to call it and put our resources where our mouths are, and by resources I mean human resources. I don't always mean money.
Right.
So I think it is a very difficult conversation for us to have, but as I see us together in this room, I just can't imagine that the amount of energy that we have collectively to acknowledge that all of us have a right to express ourselves through the cultural lens. And so until we begin to respect that in a real honest way, so if somebody else tells me how much money, why are you spending all that money to work with those kids? Why are you sending teaching artists into those neighborhoods? You know, why does Big Thought? Why does the city of Los Angeles? Why in West Africa do we have to dig into the villages and communities where the real marrow is? You guys ever suck on a bone? You know, once you eat all the meat off that bone, you get down to the really good, nutritious part. It's at the heart of that bone, to that marrow. That's our lifeline. Culture is our lifeline. Race is not something that we should shy away from talking about. It is the richness of our country. I think I'm going to not say anything else.
you, Margie.
Can I say something?
Of course you can.
I, first of all, thank you so much. I mean, just to have the opportunity to be with amazing people, amazing women, to be with all of you is always an honor because we have so much to teach each other. I think the question for me is, in terms of what do we not talk about, are the things that we are not aware of, that we have been socialized to believe that there's a right and there's a wrong, there's an up and there's a down, there's a good and a bad, and who belongs and who doesn't. And because that socialization is so presenced everywhere, in our media, in our history books, in our communities, who gets and who doesn't get, that we become accustomed to that. You know, it's sort of like, you know, the story of the frog that you put into hot water and you keep turning up the temperature and the frog becomes acclimated at every stage, and then what happens? It's dead. I think what we're talking about really is an enlivening of who we are as a people, an enlivening of who we are as we begin to respect and understand the differences. We are the same and we are different. And we have to respect all of that and everything in between in ways that we are not taught to do. I was really nervous standing up there, and I speak all over the country all the time. Why am I nervous? Because just putting it out there and talking about race, I know that there's a reaction. And because underneath that reaction, there is a fear. And so we don't talk about things that we are afraid of. And what happens when you're afraid and you're in the dark? You have to turn on the light. And so really the request to talk about race and to talk about the economic consequences and the barriers that are connected so often to race and to others is something that's required to lift us all up.
So this is great. Thank you so much. And I think there's a couple of really good strands of questions that are coming from the audience. And I think I'll start with the one that was really my question that I think, yeah, since I'm up here, right? Why not? And that is that I'm also a practitioner, right? So every day I'm making decisions as a leader, like all the rest of you in this room, about resources, and I'm working in a set of systems that I have to figure out how to pull together that actually it's harder to focus on this issue of how to get to a broader group of children. And there are dynamics inside my own organization and inside the organizations I interact with, our public schools, our city government, and inside the organizations of the partners that we interact with, that all can be a challenge around this. And what I find, and what I think this is talking about, is what are the transformative kinds of changes that we might think about making, and the other question is about this naming issue, which I think is related to this, is how do we, as leaders, how do we think about this in an institutional framework, both inside of our own institution and in the institutions that we're interacting with? How do we have real, authentic conversations about this at that level?
A few years ago, I was asked to work with a community near Tucson in an oral history project, and it was a mining community. But I didn't know anything about miners. So when I went to work on this oral history project, which was about miners, I had to learn a lot about mining, the language of what miners did and how they talked about it and what it was like to live in a mining town. All of this was new and totally foreign to my experience. As a professional, I would never think of going and telling them what the mine story should be. But we do that all the time with children's programs and youth programs. And one of the things we're afraid to talk about is how despite all the knowledge that is available on what constitutes good, effective, efficacious learning, we continue to be beholden by the outreach model. That is, you have a grant, there's a number of things that institutions have to do, put together something that serves children, and they justify that you're doing some outreach. And that outreach model, which came out of good intentions of the multicultural diversity in the NEA and some of those things, have been an obstacle for us to really say what we don't know, which would logically involve, just like it was my case with mining, asking those who are participating. So we continue to see in cities this diversity between, this conflict between programs that are set up for Latino parents that don't involve any input from Latino parents. And for some people, it's like, oh, but that's not how I would ever do it. Well, but thousands of people do this all the time. I want to create something to impact those kids who are in juvenile hall, but I don't know anything about their life experience, their trauma, the whole package that involves, but wouldn't that be a nice thing to do? So we are, in the field of arts education and arts and culture delivery, we're totally ramshackle all the time by the good intentions of the good things that stand in the way of the things that are better. And I think that that's a tough conversation for us to have, because you don't want to become the judge of other people's practices, but how do you inject the conversation about good practices in a community among all of those who are trying to serve some of the same population and competing with competing models of how to serve them?
And so this leads me to, and I think a good layer on top of this, we can keep talking about this, but this is a question that's talking about community arts education. Is there space for art's sake? And I think it's an interesting question because I'm not even sure what that means, art for art's sake. So I think that it's a definition. You know, what do we mean by that, and from whose perspective are we talking about that? So I'd love to, adding on to this idea of how we keep, how there are barriers perhaps, and maybe some of those are our own perceptions and definitions, but.
I'm not sure either that location makes a difference. If I'm in the academy and I'm an art major, does that mean that because I'm in that space, what I'm exposed to, what I bring to the table, how I work is different and has a different value if I'm working in a fire station with a firefighter who is the best tap dancer in the state? And I'm learning technique and I'm learning style and finesse. I'm not sure that the place has to make a difference. I used to be offended by the term community artist, but now I've become to see that community artist as probably one of the most skilled and authentic transmitters, one of the most authentic tradition bearers that you can find. And so I think that we live in a community, and a university is a part of it, and the fire station is a part of it, and people don't wake up and say today, for the first 2 hours, I'm going to just live in this zone, and then I'm going to move into another one. So I'm not sure that the art for art's sake is even debatable.
In a sense, it seems that's what we're talking about, is that
it's all
it's
arts.
important that arts for its own sake is available to all children in all places. But again, I think what the panel is saying, and what in a way Shakti was saying, was framing that in all children need it, but there may be an and to how that's delivered in various places for various groups of children based on their the assets that they bring to the table and the point of view that they bring to the experience.
There are a couple of things that I would like to name here. One of them is that we live in a culture where individualism is really touted as the way to be. But in fact, we live in a world that is interconnected. We are indelibly connected to one another in all kinds of ways. Jonathan, when you talked about the storm, you know, there are many people, many scientists who would talk about that as evidence to global warming. There are all kinds of situations where we understand that economically, globally, we are connected, and what happens in one country impacts what happens in another. This shrinking world requires that in attention to developing who we are as individuals, and who am I as an individual? My individuality is informed by so many things. I stand on the heads and the hearts and the shoulders of the people who've come before me. But when we only look through an individual lens, then we miss so much. We need to be able to understand that if the boat is sinking, it doesn't really matter whether you're at the bottom of the boat or holding on to the top of the mast. The boat's going down. And so it is required of us. It's not even something that can really be a luxury. It is required of us to begin to ask the kinds of questions that will allow me to say, what is it I'm not seeing? What is it that I've not been exposed to? What is it that I do not understand? What is it that I need to know so that when I'm in a community, I understand that community? Why? Because I allow myself to learn, because I allow myself to ask questions, because I allow myself to give value that is something outside of my own lived experience. And so I think individuality can get in our way. Understanding that we're indelibly connected is absolutely critical. And the last point that I want to make is that it is not about intention. It is about impact. We talk about good intentions, but what is the impact of our individual and collective behavior? We can see that when we look at the demographics. We can see that when we look at the facts of who has and who doesn't. Lots of good intention, but what's the impact?
So this is a great question, and I think another element of this that is about how you change, right? So if we say, if we looked at our own performance as a field, we could say that we have a lot of good intentions, and there are shining examples of great strides being made in this area. But as a collective group, we still have this overriding question of why is it that in our country there are some children who have access to this and some children who do not. Children of color have less access to high quality experiences overall in their education. That's just a fact. That's just the truth. That's our impact, ultimately. And I'm wondering how you feel this may be a part of this great question. And it is that the majority of the leadership, and I would even go so far as to say the majority of the field staff even, of the organizations that many of us run are white. What are the implications of this for racial justice in arts education and in this field? Great question.
Well, it's a complicated question because when we have only an answer that is based only on an identity politics type of answer and not a universal lifting of everybody in a sort of compassion, in an agenda, an ethics, and a practice of compassion, then we're back to square one.
There you go.
Because all of the racial minorities in this country, and I, as a Latina woman, I can say this, and others can perhaps not say it. There's a lot of racism. There's a lot of racism within the bloc that is Latino. There's a lot of class issues, right? There's a lot of nationality issues of which countries are more, you know. So you come to repeat that again if your only path is only changing the color of the table or only identifying a racial agenda that is only about numbers. How many people of this, how many people of that. When you cut through that, you include that. You include who's sitting at the table, but that's only the beginning. Then you move on to the other thing that is this targeted universalism. What is good for the white middle class is also good for those right? And the reverse is true. What is good for the impoverished minority student that is a language, learner, it's got to be good for those who are in a more privileged position, because then you're targeting that. And I think that that's tough for us to talk about, because it requires a massaging of the racial, ethnic discourse in a way that is not even more uncomfortable than what Dr. Butler was saying, which is the complexity of it within, once you begin to dissect it. But then the answer is not, oh, well, we're all equal and we're all happy, and then to sort of banish that and say, oh, it's just about a universal thing. That's also not the answer, because you do also have to have the stories and the perspective of those around the table. So it gets really dicey, but it gets interesting when you understand it as a practice that is based on an ethics, on an ethics of inclusion, that where difference is not less or more, but different simply means different, as opposed to a simple dichotomy of which one is better.
So we have
Does
time
that
maybe,
resonate?
we have time maybe for one last reflection before.
I'm sorry, maybe I was.
Okay. I love that. I love it. He's saying you have 5 minutes and then hands me a stack of things. What do you do? Oh, 1 minute and hands me a stack. Okay.
This is why I'm never invited to MSNBC or Fox, because I've never been able to keep my answers very short.
No. Excellent. Margie, maybe you could close for us here.
I want to go back to this question about the leadership question, and I think that it is interesting that, again, how we count the value of the leader, and we say, we're able to say that there are so few people of color at the helm, but the real important folks are also the foot soldiers. Now, let me quickly go to this. For those of us that are in leadership positions, it doesn't matter what our race is or what our color is, it's about who we're serving, and the opportunity to open our heads up, like we were saying earlier, and learn about those communities. But it is also important that we begin to have a leadership agenda. It's important for us to want to populate the field with as many different perspectives and ideals as possible. So I'm the resident old guy at Big Thought now. It's a pretty good position to be in. Because people generally ask you for your opinion. And I think that when you're looking at a field like ours, we have leaders of color in our communities who don't hold a title other than mother or teacher or school nurse or church secretary. Those are leaders. They're thought leaders. They understand their communities. They certainly understand the children. So I don't want us to think that some institutional title makes us more valuable or more knowledgeable than thought leaders in a community setting from whom we stand to learn a great deal about those that we serve. And until we begin to understand that equity in knowledge, we're leaving out vast amounts of knowledge, I think, from this work.
Thank you. So we're going to close, and there are many more questions, but these ladies are around.
Don't talk to me.
And presenting later in the conference. So you'll have an opportunity to speak with them and hopefully get these questions answered. I want to close just by asking you as my colleagues to join me over the next several days to opening this up a bit in our conversations across the conference, to being courageous about naming and about having real, authentic conversations about how race, class, and power structures keep us locked into certain practices and ways of thinking, and how we might open that up through real connection and authentic conversation. I want us to give our brilliant panel and our speakers a great hand, and I want to thank you personally for sharing. Thank you.